N Reddy, Chairman and Managing Director, Continental Hospitals, Hyderabad, who is going to talk on role of distributive leadership to meet the challenges in healthcare.
Morning, the distinguished organizers and the governing body, the CAHOCON, the panelists on the podium, the chairpersons, and the most exciting established leaders, emerging leaders, and the future leaders that constitutes his entire audience. It is always a very tough act for a speaker to follow a very dynamic, charismatic thought leader, not just in our area, but across the country, Dr. Sangeeta. If I don't do justice to this topic or what I'm going to be speaking on, I have to blame Sangeeta to some extent. And I have a disclaimer. The disclaimer to the organizers at the end of the day is that this is the disclaimer. If I don't do justice in what I'm presenting in the next 15 to 20 minutes, and if you can't take home a profound message at the end of my talk, my disclaimer is that please settle the score with Dr. Govind Hari, Dr. Bhaskar Rao, Dr. Lulu Joseph, Dr. Agarwal, and Dr. Giridhar Gyani. So I'm clean here. Fine. So I was given this assignment. I'm not a management grad. I didn't take an MBA at the end of the day, but I have been a humble position. It happened so in my entire life from the west to the east and east to the west that I was thrown into leadership, and which I've learned several things during this course of the last 4 or 5 decades. And I have to summarize this now in 20 minutes to share that with you. But the interesting part of this subject is that I'll be speaking on distributive leadership, how it is going to impact or impacting healthcare across the world, not just in this part of the country. Now, the most interesting part is when I talked to my 2 sons, who are alumni, undergrad and postgrad alumni of the Wharton School of Business Management about 3 or 4 weeks ago, hey guys, what is distributive leadership? And both of them, very successful leaders in their own domain, they said, no, I've not heard of this. Well, that was the most sobering thing at the end of the day. If they have not heard, who are leaders, management leaders, I think it's going to be much more easier for me at the end of the day. So I go with the presumption here, the entire audience, that all of you have been leaders and all of you are emerging to be leaders. We are used to certain style of leaderships for the past from our school days or through our education and wherever we are working at the end of the day. So let me just walk you through. So there are several definitions of leadership. There are several types of leadership. Well, not impossible for me really to delve into them, but I'm going to share a few of them for us to kind of lay a context for understanding distributive leadership. Now, leadership is centralized, we all know, which is deemed to be autocratic. Leadership is decentralized, which also has various synonyms of democratic leadership, participative leadership, integrative leadership. And lastly is distributed leadership, which will be, addressing that in the next few minutes. Now, centralized leadership these are autocrats who have run organizations, these are politicians, they are other business leaders, and there's nothing wrong with that. One of the great prototypical example of history of centralized leadership was Henry Ford. And nobody can forget Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a controlling person, a young engineer who really put the automotive industry. And Henry Ford controlled every design in his company, also to the extent of Henry Ford controlled what were their employees doing outside of their company. But nevertheless, Henry Ford was successful. One of the great quotes of Henry Ford at the end of the day, which most of the management grads perhaps remember, there is no failure in this world. Failure is only an option for those who try to give an excuse. It's a very profound statement that Henry Ford has made. So like Henry Ford, we have seen in our own country, various business leaders who have been autocratic and across the world. Now, when I Googled a week ago, in healthcare organizations in India, what is the type of leadership? Very interestingly, the first thing comes up autocratic. And then they go on to say, citing an article in 2015, written by somebody from the West, which was not very appealing. India does not disseminate leadership and typically run by, physicians or family leaders, and on and on and on. But certainly there is more, changes that we are seeing in the past decade or two, and these changes are happening for the good. So when it comes to decentralized leadership, we have several examples in history. In this, from our own country, we have the Tatas, we have Azim Premjis. From the West, we have, to some extent, I guess, Bill Gates floats somewhere between autocratic and, decentralized leadership. And we have, from our own countries, several other, even Ambani is placed in that context at the end of the day. Distributed leadership, one of the great, I'll just give you the examples, then I'll set a definition for that. Distributed leadership, the people who have practiced this is the greatest company called Google. And all the Google leaders embrace distributed leadership. They have contributed tremendously to the business world about their actions and what has emerged from distributed leadership. And in India, they cite Mr. Agarwal of Oyo. He's counted in that category of distributed leadership. So on and on, I think there is change and emerging of in the world of distributed leadership. Now, as I mentioned, there are several different types of leadership. At the end of the day, one of the other types that recognizes or classifies leadership is into autocratic as well as democratic and laissez-faire. Then the Likert management systems, those of you in the business world understand this is another very important classification. Dr. Likert was an American social psychologist who has contributed from his educational theories and published various management styles and articles where he classifies leadership into four, which is participative, consultative, benevolent, authoritative, and exploitative authoritative. So beyond authoritative, you're also basically exploiting in a given company. So in a nutshell, I borrowed this cartoon from one of the publications called The Four Became BA, and whoever was the designer for this. So what is happening truly in distributive leadership? Distributive leadership is where you are basically making the organization or the individuals who have the talent and the expertise accountable and participative. And the collective wisdom of these individuals translates in the organization into a very fluid and emergent property, which means to say that the organization becomes very dynamic with the contribution of these multiple individuals, and it's not something that is just controlled by one person who is heading or who is leading the role. Now, distributive leadership is based on three key ideas. Leadership is a product of an interacting group or network of individuals. It is not based on the actions of a single person. Number two, expertise should be distributed across the organization and not concentrated in the hands of select individuals. Number three, the possibility of leadership should be made open to those who might have been previously excluded. Distributed leadership is a broad and a diverse concept and shares some overlap with other types of leadership, which I just spoke about, which is democratic, participative, collaborative, and shared leadership. And it promotes leadership as a fluid and emergent property and avoids the typical leader-follower dynamic and distributes the responsibility based on expertise. The model also envisages or professes that in distributive leadership, there's diversity, there is maturity, there's interaction of the individuals at the end of the day who are bringing out a fantastic new culture that completely modifies and shapes up your governance of that institution. It's not only healthcare, but all the institutions across. Such is the profundity of distributive leadership. Now, who coined this word? Where did this come from? Is it new? Is it ancient? If you read the literature, distributive leadership has been around in 1250 BC. Many ancient civilizations practiced this. But in the modern world, distributive leadership to some extent was taught on the fringes in the 1920s and 1950s. But the key architects who really kind of brought this to the forefront in the past 2 decades was Dr. Ed Hutchins Dr. Ed Hutchins, during his navigation theories while flying on the naval spacecraft, was the first architect to basically define what is distributive leadership. And subsequently, some of the great management scholars, James Spillane, Peter Braun, Clara Harris, all of them in the last 15 to 20 years have emerged to be the spokespersons who have published articles and who are driving this philosophy. And I'm going to share a slide where organizations are and how they're adopting this. So traditional leadership versus distributed leadership, I don't want to go into great details. You can clearly read, you can read there. In traditional leadership, you take decisions and give instructions, and you tend to sometimes delegate tasks. Whereas in shared leadership, the team leader enables people to act. He facilitates teamwork. He stimulates experimentation. He coaches and gives feedback, which is extraordinarily important. So that is the contrasting difference between these two styles. And what are the hallmarks of distributive leadership at the end of the day? This was given very nicely, stated by Dr. Linda, who happens to be the Dean of Illinois State University. And she has contributed tremendously to these 8 principles of distributed leadership. Number 1 is shared responsibility. Number 2, shared power and authority. Synergy. In an organization, if there is no synergy by the individuals who are contributing to our daily works, there is no organization. Leadership capacity. A good leader is always should try to build up capacity in the organization, giving an opportunity to those who mature to be the future leaders and who can become the stakeholders of success. Organization learning, extraordinarily important. We continue to learn all the time. If this learning is not available, leadership will not mature. Equitable and ethical climate. If you have multiple people who are involved, they certainly will question the ethics of the organization, and they will contribute that the organization really kind of adopts and embraces ethical principles for its success. Democratic and investigative culture and macro community engagement is very important, that how we are perceived internally and externally, how our outreach for any organization, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a clinic, whether it is a IT company or manufacturing company, pharma company, does not matter. Perception at the end of the day, is extraordinarily important. So those are the 8 cardinal principles of distributed leadership. And then here, how do you really kind of bring this forth? What are the key elements here for us to trust, for us to really can emerge and embrace these 8 principles? End of the day, trust is extraordinarily important. If you don't trust yourself as a leader, you cannot expect trust from those who are working with you. Number 2, you trust me. You give the power, or you share the distribution, but you don't empower because you don't trust them. It won't work. So you trust yourself and you trust the individuals that you're basically giving the power. We trust the project at the end of the day. Everyone has to come together that they are in, and there is no deviation from that. We trust the purpose is very important, and we trust the indifferences. In distributive leadership does not mean that all of us have to agree it all the time. Absolutely not. It is really a forum and a platform where you can really bring forth your differences. You debate them at the end of the day and see that you're working in the interest of the organizations for its ultimate success. And last but not the least is that, shared leadership. So, which is very important. Good leaders replicate their qualities in other people. So the responsibility of leadership is distributed, which is very important. All of us, please take cognizance of that. Now, the essential aspects, I'm going to skip this essential, but it's a very quick cartoon to show that. This is the triangle by Spillane. Each segment of the triangle represents here leaders, followers, and situation. And that is distributive leadership. It's a leadership practice that is determined over a period of time. So remember this triangle. You have leaders, you have followers, you have a situation. And if this kind of a leadership practice is really kind of instituted in every organization, I think we in healthcare can really be something fantastic. I was going to skip this slide. I'm going to go to just want to say a few words about distributed leadership Google. Eric Schmidt and Larry Page, at the end of the day, who really built Google up. Prior to building Google, they were academics. They were merely researchers who wrote papers, but they believed in something. And that something is that their ability to express themselves and come forth with ideas. So that fundamental belief of theirs went on to hiring the best of the talent across the world. And they empowered their employees with a 70-20-10 rule. What is a 70-20-10 rule? 70% of the times Google employees are engaged in the core Google work. The core Google work being, at the end of the day, is the Google advertisements and Google search. And 20% of the times, they are allowed to participate in the emerging Google activities that go on to create, something else, like Google Maps and whatnot. And 10% of the times they're allowed to do whatever they want, come up with their own brilliant ideas. That's how Google Glass was created. That's how Google News was created. So why people were joining Google is that ability to have the 10% of the time where they were able to think and contribute, and without any top down, and without somebody basically discarding their ideas. And that's how this company emerged, so successfully. And Eric Schmidt, who joined Google in 2001, basically for 20 years he ruled Google. Everybody was circumspect in the business world. Will Smith embrace the founder's philosophy? But Smith did exactly embrace the founder's philosophy and made the first $1 billion for Google 10 years ahead of Microsoft. And his principles were very simple. Get to know your employees, establish new ways to reward them. If there are problems that need to be solved, let employees own them. Ensure employees can function outside of Google's hierarchy. And these were his cardinal principles. And last but not the least is that Google's Sundar Pichai. Many management gurus today believe that in the 21st century, Sundar Pichai's 12 qualities, if embraced by every thought leader, they will be fantastic. They'll be fantastic leaders. And what are the 12 qualities people have talked about Sundar Pichai? Humanity, understated, relationships, collaborative, deal maker, mastery, fearless, transformational, math and science, engineering, and visionary. He's a true distributive leader. And my last couple slides before I wind down. And how does all this apply to healthcare? I deliberately do not want to talk too much about where we are with healthcare, but if these principles are really incorporated in healthcare for all of us, this is like just to show you where is distributive leadership going. The blue line, in the last 30 years, it is really kind of superseding your democratic and all the other types of leadership at the end of the day in organizations. And why distributive leadership is the future of management? Simply, the future of work requires nimble leadership to cultivate a workforce that is able to accommodate new technologies and evolving risks. So relating, sense-making, and visioning. And here is, and also inventing contribute. This is our healthcare. Now just tell me, how could one CEO, one COO, one quality officer of an organization, if somebody did a quick count, there are about 24 of these responsibilities on day to day to run your administration. Now you take your medical services here. Now clinical services run your medical and surgical services. There are another 18, 20, altogether 60 of them. And you're entrusting this responsibility in the hands of one person or two people, we are set for failure. So in conclusion, I'm sure you got the message that distributive leadership is a way to go. And I myself have practiced this for the last 3 to 4 decades. My office is an open door. And everyone knows, some of my office staff is here today, that I allow anyone at any time, even sometimes in serious meetings, that they can have an entrance, they can express, they can share their idea. And we take from the junior most person for their contribution and see that how this can apply at Continental hospitals. True leaders don't create followers. They create more leaders. That's my message. Thank you all.